Nudging is taking into account the way that humans actually work, not just in principle, but as we work in practice. So a nudge is defined as, if you take the brief definition, as any kind of intervention that shouldn't work in principle, but does in practice. So a good example of a nudge is the famous fly in the urinal from the Schiphol airport. It's the example where the engineer who had to draw the bathrooms thought in of the idea of engraving a fly in the urinals in order to attract men's attention, so they would be aware of where they were peeing, so they didn't pee on the floor, on the walls and down themselves, and instead in the urinals. And it purportedly reduced male spillage by 80%. It's a really nice example of what a nudge is, because it makes use of the thing that we have limited attention as human beings, and catching our attention, just that mere little thing can have a huge impact, both on how your pants will look, but also on how much you have to clean the toilets in an airport. A nudge is any intervention that shouldn't matter in principle but does in practice. It's a very nice rule of thumb to remember something which becomes more complex if you read yourself into it. But just to make sure that we agree on what a nudge is, then we'll dip a bit into what we mean by what we should do in principle, namely a model showing this. And you shouldn't be confused, because this is a model that you know quite well. This is a model of explaining behavior, predicting behavior, and designing for behavior that most people use at least 200 to 300 times every day. The basic system is that if we want to explain somebody's choice of behavior A, we look to some kind of processing, which we usually assume is a reflective, rational process where people have certain values, certain information, then they form certain beliefs based on their information, and then they form certain preferences over choices based on their values, right? So if I have the choice between apple and cake, I'll say I would really like to lose some weight. I should go for the apples, and I believe apples are more healthier than cake. And then the reason why I want to lose some weight, or the reason why I chose apples rather than cake, would be, well, we have some consequences which are nice for me. This is the way we usually talk about human behavior, and the underlying assumption is a nice one that we know. The underlying assumption is a picture of human nature and human choice and human behavior, where we reflect about our choices based on our preferences and beliefs. That's all fine. The only problem is that it is completely wrong when we turn to the behavioral sciences. When we turn to the behavioral sciences, it turns out that a little bit of our behavior looks like this. But most of our behavior, and when I say most, I could put some numbers on it, but it would be completely arbitrary. But we go around 99% or 93% for certain domains. We look more like this, right? This is the guy who wakes up in the morning on a diet and really does well during the morning. He avoids cake, he avoids all kinds of unhealthy foods, drinks skimmed latte and so forth. He even has a healthy lunch with salad. So when the afternoon comes, he's really proud of himself, so he rewards himself with a big slice of cake, right? And this is also the guy who watches more television of a certain channel on TV just because that channel is underneath the button 1, right? And he watches a little less of the channel which is under the button 2, and a little less under the button 3 channel, right? So it's not a surprise that in the US you have companies walking around paying people for being allowed to reprogram their the remote control so that their program is under button number 1. So this is the guy that we actually all are most of the time. And it means that we are influenced by physical surroundings in ways that really shouldn't matter. We are influenced by our social environment in ways that really shouldn't matter. And we are influenced by what we call mental concepts in ways that really often are fairly extremely silly. This is just a cartoon, but I haven't time to explain you the whole big idea behind it, but there is a nice popular science book about it called Nudge, for no particular reason other than the real title was Why Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron, a New Policy Paradigm in Public Regulation, and then something more. And somebody told them that you should really not call a book that, so they changed the name into Nudge, and the authors are two quite famous guys. It's one of the world's most famous behavioral economist Richard Thaler, and then Cass Sunstein, former advisor to Barack Obama and one of the world's most famous legal scholars. They wrote this very nice book. The 2 chapters that comes first are really good, and the rest of it is also good, but you can get the idea from reading the first 2 chapters, so that's what I recommend. The book draws on the concept of nudge, draws on certain academic disciplines, behavioral economics, cognitive psychology, social psychology, and user-centered design. So Donald Norman is huge here as well. And basically all of these, what combines all of these 4 disciplines is that they look at human choice and nature differently from the standard rational model that we find in economics and law and in everyday explanations of human behavior. Rather, they have this, what we call dual process theory of human behavior, which is represented here today by Homer Simpson. And if you strip the concept of nudge and go underneath it and go into the sciences, you will find that it is called something else, which is quite boring, namely applied behavioral science. So basically, it's about studying the behavior of people, looking at systematic errors, some call it irrationalities that humans tend to perform. And then what you do when you nudge is that you try to use these systematic tendencies in human behavior to create better environments, create better technologies so that they work better, that we have easier way of using them. With the coffee and cake table, or the cake and apple table, you saw that there were 4 of these tendencies, 4 of these so-called cognitive biases. But during the last 40 years, these disciplines has actually uncovered in laboratories that we have more than these 4 biases, namely something like this list, which is not the full list, but almost the full list of all the ways that we as human beings tend to fail every day, several times for each of them. So this is like the list of, some would call it behavioral diseases. And when we look at when we have an interaction between a user and a product that fails, then we don't ask in behavioral science, we don't ask the person. Sometimes we do, but we usually try to see if all the elements we know that should take place are in place, or whether some of these failures obtain for the user. So it's quite a big piece of work you have to do to work with this kind of science, but I will try to show you that it really pays off. You saw it with one table, with the coffee and cake table. I'll show you some more examples in a minute. But when we dip into the literature again, a nudge isn't just defined by the everyday rule of thumb definition. It also have a more boring definition that I'm just going to really go through very quickly. So a nudge is a function. That means that you can combine nudges with information, with technology, with whatever. A nudge is a kind of psychological tweak of something. And a nudge is then also any attempt at influencing people's judgment, behavior, and choice in a predictable way, because we don't want people to do very unpredictable things. We have hypotheses. We believe that when we arrange food in a certain way, something certain will happen. They will eat more apples, less fruit. They will eat more fruit and less cake, and not put fire on each other. And when you nudge, you work on a particular assumption that the behavior the behavior studied, is not something which is well planned and perfectly executed. You work with behavior as fallible. And then when you try to nudge somebody, then the interventions that you create are based on these insights from psychology and behavioral economics and work only by them. So that also means that nudging works independently of new rules, of removing choices from people or fiddling around with incentives. So it's kind of an anti-economic, anti-lawyer paradigm, which makes it extremely comfortable to work within. But when you saw the apple and cake buffet, you might have also thought that that's fine, that you can have a huge success for this kind of user interface, but few of us tend to eat apples and cake every day in the opera. So does this really have a political potential? So we looked recently at a bigger user interface, namely supermarkets, because we come there every day. This is me in the background, as you can see, and this is the Danish Minister for Food and Agriculture, and he's trying to eat a cake, and I'm trying to prevent him. But what we did in this supermarket was basically we took it over for 5 weeks. We could do whatever we wanted in order to increase the sales of healthy food, local foods, and organic foods. And we did some of the most basic nudging you can do, which is really cheap and really doesn't take away people's choices, and we didn't mess around with prices. So one of the big interventions looked like this. The sign says, "Boil me with the potatoes." This particular sign gave an increase in the sales of curly flowers of 45%. So this is a really basic user interface. Then we also took fruit and vegetables and moved them out of the fruit and vegetables section, because humans actually don't tend to construct their behavior in the same sense that a supermarket constructs its building in, right? So of course we want to find fruit and vegetable in a particular section of the supermarket, but there are all kinds of places where we could think of fruit and vegetables, but where we usually don't think about it because it's not present. So for instance, when you go to the meat, you usually don't find carrots and pepper and basil in the meat fridge, but here you can find it packed here and also standing next to it, and also, as we all know, the straightforward tactics of moving fruit up next to the counter. Now, we did around 50 small interventions, all of them almost at no price. Well, we had to pay for the sign, but otherwise, basically at no price, just moving things around and so forth. So basically what we were doing is taking the supermarket as a user interface and trying to see if we could rearrange it in ways that it would where it would work better for customers in order to promote health. And compared with 10 benchmark shops in the same period, and also the period of the same period the year before of this particular supermarket, we had a 24% increase in fruit and vegetables. We also had an increase in profit, an increase in customer, and increase in customer satisfaction. So this means that something can be done out there in those environments. If we turn to the organic food, this is the increase in turnover, this is the increase in profit. Vegetables, organic meat, organic eggs, turnover profits. This is extremely easy. Also, we increased the sales of local foods by 112%. So this is just meddling around with the user interface. And the next question then becomes, that's all fine because this is all preventive stuff, but how do we develop nudges if we want to develop them with our products, whatever we want to do, with our concepts? And there is a particular method that we have developed over the years. It's not revolutionary. It's just called the basis model. And it consists of 5 phases. And I will just show you how you actually work with this so you can get a picture of what it means to work with behavior-centered design, if we should call it that today. In the first phase, which is called the B phase for behavior, we actually just ask what is going on. We ask about the facts, and that is any kind of facts. I'm just going to show you the whole model using an example from an airport where we tried to reduce risk factors in passive smoking. The problem out there was that we had more than 100 smokers every hour smoking just outside revolving doors in certain places in the airport. In modern buildings, you use the revolving doors as a ventilation system, and that means basically you had 100 smokers taking their smoke and putting them right in the face of the staff next door, which was not a nice thing to do. When you look at the smoker's problem, the smoker's perspective, you might be a little bit baffled about why they're standing just outside the door, because actually there's quite big markings outside the doors here saying that you're not allowed to smoke there. And when you go around and look at where the problem is all over the airport, it is at all the doors. So you can actually see sometimes 100 smokers here in an hour, the same here, 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 here. That's 700 smokers in an hour, and the smoke being drawn into the building. This is the kind of the initial mapping where you just say, this is the problem, that's the behavior. It's a really simple choice problem. Then how do you begin to study that problem further? Well, I called my staff and said, come to the airport, pack for a holiday. They were very happy. So they showed up in the airport and they found out they had to stay in the airport for 2 months. And they were very mad at me, and I'm never going to do it again, I promised. And the first thing we did was actually follow 1,323 smokers around in the airport who didn't know it. So basically just following smokers, playing you're an agent. What is it to smoke a cigarette in the airport? Using various kind of technologies to map their behavior, everything from do they wear a rucksack, do they wear a suitcase, do they kind of, do they smoke with their left hand, right hand, do they have a hat on, so forth. Really huge amount of data. Finding out interesting stuff like that 48% of all smokers smoke their whole cigarette inside the non-smoking zone. 30% smoke their whole cigarette outside of the smoking zone. 12% lit up the cigarette in the non-smoking zone and moved out of the smoking zone. And 3% did something really weird. We also looked at the various places where this behavior took place and found out that there were huge variations that would very likely had to be attributed to the physical surroundings and environment. We also found out that all smokers almost came from inside the building. 85% of smokers came from inside the building, and half of them walked back. And there's a fairly easy explanation for that, because people tend to hand in their luggage before they go for that rewarding cigarette in an airport. So basically, really try to map the behavior. What are the behavioral flows? What are the customer journeys? But not from the customer's perspective inside their own experience, but in this case, simply mapping it out. Often we then combine it with customers' experience, and then we see if there's any discrepancies between what they perceive is happening and what is actually happening. Then we go into the to the A phase, which is very conveniently not standing for anything with an A, but is standing for diagnosis, but just think of an analysis. We have to have these acronyms because of Brussels. That's the only way to gain money. You have to have these really nice acronyms. And there in the A phase, you try to explain why things are happening as they're happening. So you try to actually, you go from the question of what to why. And again, like in the behavior phase, you may triangulate, you might use all kinds of methods you want to use. You might use focus group, interviews, introspection, videotaping, data analysis, whatever you like. But so this is just kind of a process model. And in this case, the why became focused on the smokers coming from inside the building and trying to find out why they were doing what they were doing and how they were doing it. So they tended to depart with their party, and here saying that they went outside to smoke. They walk through the rotating door and do what people do in rotating doors. They look down into the ground, especially because they have foreigners or other people, strangers around them, and they don't want to be that stupid guy who blocks the rotating door. So they look into the ground. They go outside, they stop here, like all tourists would, which is basically a stop at around 1 second, 2 seconds, which is what we call the tourist stop. It is often accompanied by a head movement from the left to the right, which means that they're trying to scout out something to find out what to do, basically. And then they move over to certain things, and we map those things out. They walk over to places where there's no wind or where there's a sunbeam. They, like as we always do as humans, to go and stand next to walls, corners, and in this case also terrace stones. But people don't like to stand in the middle of squares and so forth. So they move over to certain structures. Especially they move to places where other smokers are standing, where there are benches and where there are litter bins, and then also to where there are cigarette butts on the ground and ashtrays. That's quite trivial, and everything becomes trivial when you try to take the behavioral perspective. Then you move to the next phase, the S phase, which is the solution phase. And when you have the behavioral phase and the analysis phase, solutions really don't take much thought. They are often quite easy to grab. In this case, we use a certain principle, which actually comes from some deeper psychology called implementation intention, which basically has this consequence for human behavior. We as humans have incredibly difficult finding out what to do if we are told what not to do. So if you're banned for doing something, then you have to think, what should I do? And in many cases, if it's not a really bad thing you're about to do, you'll just do what you thought of doing the first time. So what you can really change human behavior with is telling people what to do when there is a ban, what to do instead. It has some really nice design implications. We can't go into them here, but in the airport, it just meant putting down a sticker on the ground with an arrow of where to go if you wanted to smoke. And we put it where people departed for the company and when they looked down into the ground when they went through the revolving doors. Then we move around benches and ashtrays that people tend to walk over to, and we created these zones. And they're fairly nice. We also did it with dotted lines, but the airport preferred strict lines. The dotted lines had no other effect than the fully drawn lines. There are various kinds of design elements you wouldn't think would have the function they have. For instance, this sticker has the same function as the mint in toothpaste. I'll return to that. And basically, then we have these kinds of zones, and right away we saw people would start to use them. And when we go into this phase, which is called the intervention phase, then we do an experiment. We follow, in the first case, before we put it up, 1,695 smokers to see if they're smoking as they should, and they're smoking in the non-smoking zone. This is before we put it up, and then afterwards we have 50%, more than 50% decrease in smokers just outside the doors. So this might not seem as much from the ambition of removing all smokers, but that's the thing about behavior. You cannot change behavior like going from something to nothing or from something to everything. You have to do it stepwise, and we do know what's the problem with the rest of these people. They're mainly young men sitting on terrace stones, drinking beer and smoking cigarettes, and we have a solution for that as well. It's putting flour up on top of the terrace stones, because even young men don't sit in flowers. But currently they're being monitored, these flowers, by the secret police, who have to acknowledge that they can actually be there. And then we will have a full reduction. But it's a really nice behavior change, and if you translate this into, for instance, the uptake of a particular system, then that's a huge change in behavior. And then there is the final phase, which is one of strategic implementation and so forth that we don't have to go further into. But just to bring it closer to some of the things we see when we talk about innovation, uptake, and user-centered design, I'll give you something that you all know about, namely brushing and flossing. So how many in here brushed their teeth this morning? Good. How many flossed their teeth? A lot fewer, and that's to expect. The thing about brushing and flossing is that it actually explains what it means to get people to have sustainable behavior. The stories about the history about the toothbrush and the flossing thread actually shows us why so many technologies fail. So if we begin with the history of the toothbrush was invented in 619 in China. Nobody really used it for whatever reason that we'll return to. Later on, it was kind of transmitted as a technology to Japan. That happened in the 12th century, and the Japanese didn't brush their teeth either when they got this. In the 17th century, the toothbrush arrived in Europe, and we didn't use it either until the 20th century, where somebody in the marketing industry found out that they wanted to sell a product to us, namely toothbrushes. If they could get us to use toothbrushes, they could really get us to use a lot of money, right? So how could they make us adopt the toothbrush? What happened for the user from before the 1920s, and then after, where everybody suddenly brushed their teeth? Well, they invented a psychological mechanism that made us all brush our teeth, and it looks like this. The main function to begin with of toothpaste was actually to get us to brush our teeth, because the toothbrush in itself is a flawed design. Now, in order to get us to brush our teeth, they first had to trigger us into the behavior. So if you just run your tongue over your front teeth, you will feel the dirty film. Actually, it's not dirty film, it's your own defense in the mouth that tries to protect your teeth. But they told customers that this was the dirty film, and in that sense, they invented an internal trigger, as we call it, something that will trigger the behavior all the time that people carry with them. Every day, their teeth will become a bit, and especially if you don't brush your teeth, they will be it all the time. So you can feel that there's a dirty film on your teeth, so now you have a drive where you want to brush your teeth. Then in the toothpaste, they added something which is essential for us to pick up a habit, which is namely foam. So the thing is with foam is that it provides us what is called routine feedback. And routine feedback tells us that this is working. Actually, foam in toothpaste makes the hygienic effect less. The same goes for sanitizers and hand soap. But it's there in order for the user to understand that the product is working. If you don't have foam in it, it doesn't seem to work for you. And then you will have a hard time picking up the product and keep on using it. And the final thing they added into the toothpaste was the mint breath. The mint breath has this function of what we call cognitive closure, telling your brain that the action has succeeded, that now you're done. So usually when you watch people brush their teeth, and you can do that quite a lot, it's actually quite fun, then when their mouth is filled with foam and their mouth begins to tickle from all the mint and the chemicals, then they know they're finished brushing their teeth. And if you substitute people's toothpaste with, for instance, children's toothpaste, which have less chemicals in them, they'll tend to brush their teeth for longer time because it takes longer time for them to get the closure signal. And also, they will have a harder time picking up the habit of brushing their teeth. So this basically, there are 3 principles in toothpaste, just to summarize. There's what we call the trigger, the dirty film on your teeth, perhaps your bad breath in the morning, the routine feedback in the sense of the foam, and the success feedback, the closure signal from performing the action. Without these 3 mechanisms, we call it the anatomy of the habit. Without these 3 mechanisms in place, you cannot have user adaptation which is sustainable. So this just basically means this is a checklist for any kind of product you would ever develop. If you want to have continuous user engagement with that product, it has to fulfill at least those 3 criteria. And then sometimes there are products that really fails because they have none of these criteria satisfied. This one, right? This is a failed design. It's a design problem. It's not a motivational problem. Because what is the trigger in flossing besides eating popcorn? Is it the bad breath? Not really, right? Because it won't remove it. What is the routine feedback? What is the foam in flossing? There is none. And nor is there any kind of closure signal. And that means that we have really big difficulties adopting the technology of flushing our teeth, although it's so evident that it works and everybody has good reasons to it. It's really cheap and it's not difficult, right? And a lot of you have the same problem as I do. And those who haven't are quite proud right now, because this shows that, you know, when you're willing, when you have to use the will to use a product, then like this, you would have to use the will because it doesn't work in itself. Then, you know, then you can be proud of it. I willed my flushing this morning, and I succeeded in willing that flossing. That means something funny. Whenever people are bragging about using a product, it's dysfunctional. That's one of the kind of symptoms that you would look for. If somebody shows that they can use a product that other people have difficulties using, then the product design is dysfunctional. So that's a nice symptom to go after. Then let's try to look at some of the stuff that doesn't work before we look at some more stuff that works. This is a story about the health app that really, really, really didn't work. Please don't ever make this. It was funded by public money. It had a really nice idea. The aim is for people to register the amount of alcohol they're drinking, so that they can set themselves personal goals and try to achieve behavior change by self-regulation. Now, the thing is, the target group is plus 50. What the user have to do is when they go into the supermarket, this plus 50 person, they will have to take out their smartphone, if they have one, and open their QR scanner, if they have that, if they belong to the 4% that uses that thing. Then they have to scan the QR code in a building which is made of concrete so it doesn't have internet connection. Then they have to download the program, the app, and then they have to buy their wine and go home. And when they're drinking their wine, they have to remember that down in their pocket there is a smartphone that has an app that allows them to pick up the smartphone and register the amount of alcohol they're drinking. This is really silly, right? This is really, really, really silly. But this is completely standard from the stuff we are seeing in our office coming in every day. I could have like 500 of these products with me where you just think like, what? But this is true, and this is what we are setting most of our hopes for. And there's always an app that might be true, but is there an app that works? So how can you nudge users if you have those kind of problems? That's what we turn to in the end. This is basically just trying to give you some of the things that are good things to do if you're designing for users, but you have difficulties getting users to tell about why they fail, then you can do certain things by using behavioral insights. It's basically a toolbox of essentials, and I've just handpicked them this morning, fresh from the bush. The first essential is to notice one thing, that usually people tend to mistake also users in their reports, motivational issues with cognitive effort issues. I'll explain. So the thing is, think of you if you had to climb a mountain and you stopped halfway up the side and somebody wanted you to go all the way. Well, they would say as one of the first things, well, I need to motivate you some more. Perhaps I need to pay you the double amount for climbing the hill, right? So that's what you can do with motivation, and that's a good thing to do with motivation because it's really difficult to make the hill smaller. But when it comes to behavior, the hill isn't a physical thing, it's a psychological thing. So what we have in all kinds of problems is that we have a situation where we have motivation and we have behavior change occurring in this field. And usually, users themselves, as well as people looking at them, would say that if we want a behavior change, we should motivate people more. But down here, there is another option, the backside of motivation, namely making things more intuitive, and that's often cheaper and easier and can be done by a nice design, for instance. So making things intuitive, you might have heard this slogan from nudging about making things easy, basically means making things intuitive. So what does it mean to make things intuitive? Well, I've already told you about triggers, but triggers need to be timed, and they need to be timed with critical choice situation. So, for instance, recently we had a law proposal accepted in Parliament about getting people to take active stands on organ donation, because there are some very unethical things about auto-subscribing people to the organ donor register. And those, when you don't do that, you have a lot of people who actually wanted to register, but they never get around to doing it. So we had to look into examples of how do you get people to register for organ donation if you want to prompt an answer. Well, one thing you shouldn't do is this. This is something we see a lot of. Again, the QR code. So we know it's a communication bureau who has made it. And they have put the QR code on the back of a bus. Now, the diagnosis here is that users have a need to know about the waiting time at the ER when driving behind the bus. So in this case, while driving, they'll pick up their smartphone, they'll scan the code, and they'll find out what the waiting time is. Or download the app, perhaps. Or they'll be standing at a bus stop and running after the bus trying to scan this code. This is really silly again, right? But we see a lot of public money going into trying to trigger behavior in such places which are highly unlikely. Instead, with the organ donation, we choose something which was extremely, extremely easy and cheap. We just made a pop-up box. Everybody can do this. And this is just about triggering behavior at the right point. There's no revolution here, but it's making things intuitive. And that's the thing about nudging. Everything in the rearview mirror seems very intuitive, but when you have to do it, it's not always intuitive, although this was. It has been on this homepage for 1 month, and the initial number says that we have 11,000 registrations in the organ donor register during that month by putting up this box. It's a nice thing to do. It's quite easy. It costs much less than any kind of campaign, for instance. So that was just about, you need to trigger behavior. You need to think about what should trigger your behavior and at what time. And basically, it's about timing. And we can all do like this. This is like asking a surgeon to say, you really ought to wash your hands before operating people. And they will go, of course, but they will still forget sometimes. And we often see timing being forgotten because it's so obvious. Then there's the psychological barriers that people fail to realize. There's a nice example. There are some flaws in the experiment. But in this example, the UK government tried to get people to insulate their lofts. And there was quite a nice subsidy program supporting you as a citizen insulating your loft. But nobody really took up the program. Nobody really signed on. And people were worrying, like, is the subsidy too small? Should we pay people more in subsidy to insulate their loft? After all, it takes 2 hours to insulate the loft, and you'll have earned all the money back within 6 months, and then it's mere profit for doing something which is also good for the environment. So, but should we really offer them more money? And then somebody took the behavioral glasses on and said, well, what might be the problem here? Because we really have a low take-up on this program. So what might be the problem for people's behavior to kick off? Well, people use their loft the same way you use the top shelf in your fridge. You put things there that you really don't want to depart with but never want to see again. So when people were contemplating insulating their lofts, they didn't face just 2 hours of handymen doing something in their loft. They faced a lot of work where they had to put things down from the loft, sort it, look into their past. Nobody likes their past. And then find out what to do with all this stuff and then carry it back. So what they did actually was something really nice. They made a little ad campaign next to the announcement of the program where the customer got information that everybody knows about. Namely that you could call this number of 2 moving men and they would, at your own price, come and take the things down for you and sort it out, perhaps drive some of it away and some of it carry it back to the loft. We all know that there exist companies that do this. So it's not a big revolution, but when they put it up next to the program announcement, they had a tripling in participation in the program, and when they moved some of the subsidiaries over on that on the movers, then they have 5 times as many people than the baseline participating in the program. So this is just about asking what is the psychological barrier preventing you from doing something simple. Sometimes users can tell you about it, often they can't. Often you have to find out what is the barrier here. There was a recent study in Albania where they had to have people to take their medical prescription, the medicine, and they had huge numbers of people not adhering to their prescription plans. And they found out one of the big barriers was completely obvious when they took on these classes, namely that people had to drive from home and go to the hospital, sit and wait, and then go back, because they had to take the medicine under supervision of a doctor. So basically what they did was that they allowed people to take the medication online so the doctor could see it, and they had an increase in adherence to the medical program. So that's really simple when you start to look at things this way. Then there's stuff about reducing complexity. Sometimes we want users to do something which is complex, like this. This is the process for registering a company in Denmark, and there are 148 possibilities of registering a company. So this is one of the problems. Every time we have a complex system and we want the users to make choices, then they get the problem that often there are so many choices to make that they sometimes let other people decide for them and they ask too much. In this case, users called a hotline which had 70 phoners answering phone calls about this. It was completely insane because nobody knew how to find their way around this system, and that was despite having a very, very nice homepage which had been cleared by user interviews. So people really liked this. It's a very nice series of animated videos. But what they do is basically telling you all the information you could need to know if you were a lawyer in the Danish business authorities. So it's a really nice voice, it's a really nice animation, and it goes through all the rules and tells you what to do in nice small segments. But the problem is that when people, they hear these videos, at some point they drop off and they just try it out, and then they make the wrong registrations or they call up the hotline. So we actually made a psychological solution for them, which looks like this. This is just a decision tree. So it's asking you questions, but in small pieces like, do you expect your company to have a turnover of more than 50,000 Danish kroner the next 12 months? Yes or no? Do you expect to employ anybody within the next 14 days? Yes or no? Do you expect to import bananas? Yes, no? And then it just goes on. This is really nice. This system took around 1 hour for people to register the company. And in this system, it took around 4 minutes. So what we did was we did a randomized control experiment with 200 businesses who had to register the new company. And in the standard control group, which had the usual web page, they had a correctness in registration of 65%, while in the experimental group that got a decision tree, we had adherence of 80% of correctness. And what about people's experience? Well, they were much happier about the new system. Another question that I have in the graphs on here was about the lecture that went before they had to register their company. And it turned out when people became happier about the registration system, they became more unhappy about the lecture just before. So that's also something you want to contemplate if you're trying to work with users and user experience, that what they might have just experienced before or after might have a huge systematic influence. The baseline experiment is an experiment where we ask a lot of CEOs about the value of a bottle of whiskey. So I'll just run you through that experiment. Basically what you're asked is to evaluate the value of this whiskey. And as it turns out, in one group, they evaluate this bottle of 10 years Talisker whiskey at the value of 450 Danish kroner. And in the other group, the average evaluation is 294 kroner. The actual value of the bottle is 379 kroner, so that's in between. So the question becomes, why did one group make a really high evaluation, and why did one group make a really low evaluation of this bottle of whiskey? Well, it turns out that everything depends on what we asked them just before they made the evaluation. So in the one group, we asked them, do you believe that this bottle of whiskey is more or less than 600 kroner? And in the other one, do you believe that this bottle of whiskey is more or less than 200 kroner? And afterwards, we asked them, so how much do you believe that it is worth? This is called the anchoring effect, and it's really robust. You don't even have to talk about the item. You can talk about something completely else. You can ask people about their social security number. If it's low, they'll come out with a lower evaluation. If it's high, they'll come out with a higher evaluation. But what it does influence is people's expectations about, for instance, the value or the experience of something. And this is turned into a general service principle. We'll just call it the service principle. It's really simple and it's really nice. The S means service. The O means oplevelse, which means kind of the objective experience. And then you have forventninger, which is expectations. So you have service equals the experience minus expectations. And you might see how this works if you're standing in a queue. If you're told that you'll be served or dealt with in 5 minutes, or let's say 10 minutes, and 15 minutes go, then when you pass the 10 minutes point, you'll start to be angry. If you're told, for instance, that the waiting period will be 10 minutes and you're served after 5 minutes, then you'll be happy. You can also reverse it in the sense that imagine you come home from work, you have to call your wife, you're late, and you call and you say, you know that you can either say to her, I'll be there in 10 minutes or in 30 minutes, but you'll most likely be there in 20. You would like to say 10 minutes. But you could also say 30. But why on earth would you say 30 if you know it's around 20 minutes, right? If you say 10 minutes, because that will make her relaxed, she'll be angry when you enter the house because she waited for 10 minutes and then she had to wait for 10 minutes more. Her expectations were at one point. On the other hand, if you said 30 minutes, she would be angry in the phone, but when you enter the house after 20 minutes, she will be happy. This means a basic consequence of the servicing principle in restaurants, for instance, is that you always say that it takes 3 minutes to get a table for a customer because it might take 30 seconds, and then they'll be happy. But if you say it takes 30 seconds and it really takes a minute, they'll be angry from the beginning. So you can actually, if you're talking about service and the experience of service, you can do quite a lot in an easy and cheap way by working with people's expectation. So expectation management is a crucial component of any kind of business plan when you're trying to sell a product to a customer, for instance. In the objective experience, you have other funny things, like in the airport when people are tired of waiting at their suitcases coming on the luggage band. They found a solution in the 80s that really worked nice to increase customer satisfaction. They didn't do anything with the band or the pace that the suitcase arrived with. They just redirected people so they had to walk for a longer time until they reached the band. Because we don't mind walking, we hate waiting. At elevators, when they're old, what they do today in most hotels, if you have an old elevator and people are complaining about it, you put up mirrors. Because they might be slow now, but now you have a mirror to look at yourself in. and then the waiting time decreases, and consumer satisfaction just goes out the window. It's completely insane. So basically, when you go into what an experience is, there's various ways of nudging consumer experience. And you need to know this, first of all, if you have to interact with the user in designing your product. But you also need to know how to manage expectations and experience when you have the product. And there is a systematic in that as well. Then finally, there are rewards, and then one more thing. We like to reward people. We all know that it works better if it's a lottery, because humans have a tendency to overestimate the likelihood of winning in a lottery. We overestimate small probabilities. So if you say to a person there's a 1% likelihood, they'll go, hell yeah, and treat it like 8%. So if you want to reward customers, or you have a product that you want to run on gamification principles or something like it, then you have to build lotteries into it. Not that they need to win money, but they just have to introduce some kind of chance element. And the best chance element you can have is when you don't know what the reward is, but you kind of know what it will be like. And here you have one of the biggest successes, product-wise, in terms of adaptation of really weird products, the Kinder Egg. The reason why the Kinder Egg works is that you really know that there's a toy in it, but you don't know what, and then you're pleasantly surprised. This is one of the fundamental principles of Facebook, actually. You try to trigger people at the right time, tap on the app, and when they enter, you see faces that you know, but you don't know what they're talking about. This makes people really like Facebook, really find it interesting every time they return to the product. There's a whole science about how to get people rewarded. It's called prospect theory. It's really great. We won't talk about it, but I just want to direct your attention in that direction. But let's return to the final things. One of them is feedback. Feedback is lost in so many products. Feedback for the users is one of the basic ingredients in all user design lists, but a lot of products go through without feedback. So if you take the buildings we have, we care a lot about our energy consumption currently. But the way we are trying to get feedback on our energy consumption is usually placed in a basement. So the meter is in a basement or in a cheap IKEA cupboard when you enter the house. And one of the ways that many people say that we should treat this problem or try to create behavior change in this kind of scenario is by creating apps. But then again, we have apps in our pockets. We use them for all other kinds of things. So there's a nice experiment from the US. It's an old one, so we're going to replicate it. It's a pilot experience from the US where they have designed a lamp which changes the color and the frequency of pulsation depending on how much electricity which is used in the home or on the net. In the pilot in the US, they had a reduction in peak hours of 40% in energy consumption. This is nothing else than a feedback mechanism. It's an extension of what else we have. And that's another thing we see. We often see behavioral overkills in terms of new products and innovative products. You see people coming in with apps, with home pages with them, and they have all kinds of things you can monitor on these very nice programs, but what people basically need is a lamp in their home. The last thing I found most interesting about creating sustainable actions or sustainable interaction with a product is what we call investments and commitments. To begin in the healthcare industry, we have a very, very simple piece of technology which is called the meeting time you make with a doctor. It really costs nothing. It means that in most countries these days, the doctor will tell the patient that we'll have to see each other again, and the secretary will give you a time. She will schedule a time for you. And then when you leave, the secretary will hand you a piece of paper that says the date and the time you have to come back to the doctor. Fairly simple piece of technology, this piece of paper. The problem is that a lot of people don't come back. They forget their time or they stay away for whatever happens. It's called no-shows, as we all know. And it costs the healthcare system millions, if not billions, depending on which countries you look at. In the UK, they tried something funny. They tried to look at what the technology actually comprised. It's a commitment mechanism. Making an agreement about when to meet up again is a commitment mechanism. And is the best way to arrange that commitment mechanism actually by writing on a piece of paper by a secretary and handing it to you? They raised this question and they devised an experiment where they had 3 groups. One of them, in one of these groups, what you had was the usual system, except that you had to repeat the time verbally that were given to you by the secretary. In another group, you had to repeat the time verbally, but you also had to write it down. You had to write the time down yourself. And in the third group, you not only had to repeat it verbally, write it down yourself, but there was also a poster in the waiting room saying that 9 out of 10 patients shows up to their doctor's appointment. This is really, really basic technology, but the beauty is in the psychology, the psychological aspect of these very simple things that we don't even think of as psychology. Because when we look at the numbers, those who just had to repeat their time verbally had a reduction of 3.5% in no-shows. When they had to write it down themselves in addition, 18%. And when you put up the poster in addition to that, 31.7% reduction in no-shows. This is mere psychology, it's not even technology. But that's all the elements that we see missing when we see apps and healthcare devices and so on. We see a very big lack of regard for the psychological aspects of products, even when they have been user tested. And I think one of the biggest ways to push user-centered design is actually that those managing those processes learn more about these aspects that users cannot tell about themselves, so you can spot them when you try to help users developing or co-developing a really good product. The last thing, and I promise it's the last thing because I've gone 1 minute and 27 seconds over time, is experience in memory. So one thing is getting people back by making a commitment, for instance. But what about how they remember your product and how they remember the interaction? That's really important as well. And we know that from one study and from one particular application. The study is a study of pain in colonoscopy examinations. That means that you get this kind of thing up your bum, right? And it's really painful, I've been told. And you have to read these two graphs like this, like, ow, ow, ow! And this over here, you can see this, that was 8 minutes. This one is more like, ow, 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 ow! So this is longer, right? Which one would you prefer? This one? Yeah, right? Now, there was a reason why this was made, because there's something called the peak-end rule in memory, which means that human beings base their experience in memory on only two components, namely the peak and the end. And in this experiment, you had the standard examination here, short. As soon as the doctor learns what he needs to know, he stops. Over here, they just extended the examination for fun, right? Or to learn something, whether this peak-end rule actually applies. Because this was an examination you had to have over and over again. And a lot of people didn't come back to the examination. But as it turned out, more people in the experiment came back to the next examination when they had this test than this test. Because they remember it as a better experience, because the end here is lower, while you have the same top here over the end is higher. So this is one of the most important aspects in interaction with the product, is how does the end feel like. And you know this from a particular thing, which is basically a business concept, which is IKEA. So IKEA had the problem that when you leave IKEA, then you have to pay some money. And that's called the pain of paying, and that's really not a good way to end a relationship. Usually you don't want to come back. Especially since in IKEA you tend to use more money than you planned. But what is the last thing that happens in IKEA? Cheap food. When you've paid your money, you have the option to buy really cheap food. And basically what that amounts to is deleting your memory of paying and substituting it with something very cheap, so people will remember IKEA as very, very cheap. So that's experience management at a high level, and it really works. So these are just some of the components. Very few of them had to do with healthcare. But the reason is, if I take a healthcare situation, you'll just copy-paste. Here you have to think about, how does this particular principle relate into healthcare innovation? All of these mistakes are common. I hope you learned something that you can use the next time you try to develop something. So thank you.